Have you ever noticed how we tend to think that success is just tied to how smart you are?
Yeah, like the smarter you are, the more you should achieve.
Right, like a straight line to the top.
Makes sense, right?
But then you start looking a little closer and you see all these super smart people and organizations, even entire countries, making some pretty big
Oh,
blunders.
yeah. It's like, what's the deal with that?
So we're doing a deep dive today into this whole thing about why smart people fail.
And we've got some really interesting stuff to work with for this.
We do. We've been digging into excerpts from smart people's failure analysis,
That's right. Tons of case studies, business, science, politics,
even intelligence agencies, so like the folks who are supposed to see things coming.
and they still mess up sometimes, big time.
So our mission here is to figure out why this happens. We're not just saying, oh, they were dumb.
No, no, no. We're going beyond that.
We want to look at like the bad decisions, the blind spots.
The weird quirks of how our brains work that can trip us up.
And, sometimes just plain bad luck.
It all plays a role. So, where do you want to kick things off?
I think the business world is a good place to start.
Okay, yeah, why not?
Because you see those classic examples of companies with brilliant minds at the helm,
All the resources in the world.
but they still manage to make some pretty big strategic missteps or completely misread a market.
And what's so fascinating is sometimes failing isn't a bad thing.
Right. That's what the smart people's failure analysis thing argues for.
Exactly, what they call intelligent failure.
Which, to be honest, sounds a little strange at first.
Yeah, like a contradiction, right.
But the idea is that these failures are actually born out of experimentation.
Like they're trying something new, venturing into uncharted territory.
And they might hit a wall, but they learn something valuable in the process.
Exactly. They make a hypothesis, test it out, and even if it doesn't work, they get this valuable data.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
The report actually uses the example of Eli Lilly.
Oh, yeah, the pharmaceutical company.
They had this lung cancer drug, Alimta.
I remember that. Initially, it didn't do so well in trials, right?
Yeah, a real setback.
So did they just scrap the whole thing?
Nope. They took a step back,
Analyze the data again.
and that's when they realized something crucial.
What was that?
The drug interacted in a very specific way with folic acid.
Interesting. So understanding the failure led to a major breakthrough.
Exactly. It became a really successful treatment in the end.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
And it's a testament to their scientific rigor.
Right, and not giving up at the first sign of trouble.
Persistence. But it's not just about big pharma.
No. The report also talks about, like, Sarah Blakely with Spanx.
Oh, yeah. And Barbet Nicole Clicquot, the woman behind Vive Clicquot Champagne.
Now, those are two very different businesses.
They are. But they both had one thing in common. They had a ton of setbacks on their way to success.
Like a surprising number.
It's almost like failure was just part of the process for them.
And that's kind of reassuring, don't you think?
It is. It shows that even these incredibly intelligent, driven people, the ones we see as these, like, success stories, they didn't have it easy.
Right. It wasn't just a straight shot to the top.
It's like maybe failure isn't a sign of lack of intelligence, you know?
But like a stepping stone.
Exactly. Yeah. Like a necessary part of innovation, of doing something truly new and groundbreaking.
On the flip side, though, we see these smart companies trying to expand globally.
Yeah. Looking to conquer new markets.
But then they completely miss the mark because they don't get the local context.
Yeah, like if it works here, it'll work everywhere kind of thinking.
And that's where you get, like, the Walmart story in Germany.
Oh, Walmart in Germany. Now, that's a classic case study.
A company that's, like, the definition of American retail success.
Huge, efficient, low prices.
But they went into Germany and tried to impose their model, like, without any real adaptation.
And it backfired spectacularly.
It did. The report points out these things that Walmart probably thought were strengths.
Like what?
Like their employees always smiling.
The morning stretching routines.
These things just didn't translate well in Germany.
Yeah, they actually came off as, like, inauthentic or even creepy.
And it wasn't just cultural differences, right?
No, they ran into trouble with German labor laws, too.
Minimum wage regulations, things like that.
They were basically unprepared for the legal landscape.
Which is a pretty basic thing to overlook.
It's like they assumed their American playbook would just automatically work.
And it shows that even things like company culture can become a liability if you don't adapt.
Absolutely. It's like they needed to do a deep dive into the German context.
And they didn't, so they ended up pulling out entirely.
Ouch. Expensive lesson.
It is. And then there's the Starbucks example in Israel.
That's another interesting one. You'd think Starbucks, with all their resources, would have done their homework.
Right, like market research 101.
But apparently, they missed some key things.
Like what?
Like, Israel didn't really have that strong of a coffee-to-go culture.
That's pretty crucial for Starbucks.
It is. And then the locals thought Starbucks coffee was kind of weak.
Compared to what they were used to?
Yeah, like they preferred stronger, darker roasts.
And Starbucks didn't really adjust their menu.
Not enough, apparently. They were kind of stuck in their ways.
Like they thought their brand would be enough to win people over.
It seems that way. And they also had some trouble finding the right local partners.
So even with market research, they weren't really listening to what the market wanted.
And that's a key takeaway, even for a giant like Starbucks.
They had to adapt, and they didn't.
And then there's Airbnb in China. They were there for 7 years, but eventually they pulled out.
They did, and they blamed it mostly on the pandemic.
But the report suggests there were some deeper issues, right?
Yeah, like with localization.
Like tailoring their platform to the Chinese market.
Things like the user interface, translating everything properly.
And integrating local maps. It's not just about slapping on some Chinese characters.
And they were slow to add things like Alipay and WeChat Pay.
Which are essential for doing business in China.
So even though the pandemic was a factor, it seems like their localization efforts were just too little, too late.
It's like they underestimated the importance of really embedding themselves in the Chinese digital ecosystem.
And it cost them.
Big time. So, moving on from the business world, let's talk about science.
Okay, yeah, because the report highlights how even in science, where you'd think logic and reason reign supreme,
You'd think so, right?
even brilliant scientists can stumble.
They can. And sometimes it's due to limitations of, get this, imagination.
Failures of scientific imagination. It sounds almost impossible, doesn't it?
Like, scientists are supposed to be imaginative, right?
Exactly. But the report gives all these examples of where brilliant minds were limited by the prevailing scientific frameworks of their time.
They couldn't see beyond what was currently accepted as true.
Or they couldn't envision the future technologies that would allow them to make new discoveries.
It's like they were stuck in their own time, in a way.
They give this example of the resistance to the atomic theory in the 19th century.
Oh, yeah, like people couldn't wrap their heads around the idea of atoms.
Because you couldn't see them.
Right, not directly.
And this guy, Ernst Mach, who was a really smart physicist,
He had trouble accepting it.
because he couldn't imagine that we'd ever have tools powerful enough to actually observe atoms.
It's like he couldn't see past the limitations of the technology of his day.
Exactly. And there's another example with Auguste Comte,
Who was he?
a French philosopher.
Okay.
He was convinced that we'd never be able to know the chemical composition of stars,
Really? Why not?
because he couldn't imagine a technology like spectroscopy, which is how we analyze starlight to determine its composition.
Wow. So it wasn't a lack of intelligence, it was a lack of, like, envisioning future possibilities.
Precisely. And even when scientists get groundbreaking results, sometimes their existing mental models prevent them from seeing the real significance.
Like they're looking for one thing and miss the real discovery.
Yeah, and they use the example of Enrico Fermi.
The physicist.
Yeah. He accidentally demonstrated nuclear fission in his lab.
Wait, accidentally?
Yeah. He did the experiment, got the results.
But didn't realize what he'd done.
He thought he'd created a new element.
Because
The idea of splitting an atom was just like so outside the realm of possibility at the time.
that's incredible. He made this groundbreaking discovery,
Yeah.
but his brain couldn't process it.
And then there's the initial skepticism about neutrinos.
Neutrinos, aren't those like these tiny, almost massless particles?
Yeah, incredibly difficult to detect.
Right.
But scientists at the time couldn't imagine we'd ever have the technology to detect them.
Or the sources, like nuclear reactors, which we didn't have back then.
So again, limited by the technology of the time.
And even Ernest Rutherford, the guy who's considered the father of nuclear physics.
He dismissed the idea of harnessing energy from the atom.
Wow. That's pretty ironic, considering what he's known for.
It is. But it just shows how even brilliant minds can get stuck in their ways.
Yeah, it's like a cautionary tale. You have to be open to new ideas, even if they seem crazy at first.
Now, of course, not all scientific failures are just about, like, a lack of imagination.
Right. Sadly, sometimes it's about ethics.
The report talks about Andrew Wakefield.
Oh, yeah, the guy who published that fake study linking the MMR vaccine to autism.
A real low point in scientific history.
It was. He manipulated data, fabricated results,
And he did it for money, apparently.
And his study led to a lot of fear and distrust of vaccines.
which contributed to outbreaks of measles and other preventable diseases.
It's tragic. It shows how intelligence without ethics can be really dangerous.
And it's a reminder that scientists, just like anyone else, can be motivated by things other than the pursuit of truth.
Yeah, sometimes personal gain or ideology gets in the way.
And the report also briefly mentions how resistance to new ideas can happen even in science.
Like, even when the evidence is mounting.
Yeah, they use the example of the initial skepticism towards plate tectonics.
Oh, right. That the continents actually move around on the Earth's surface.
It took a long time for that to become widely accepted.
Even though the evidence was pretty compelling.
So it's not just a lack of intelligence, it's also about, like, attachment to existing paradigms.
Yeah, it's hard to let go of what you think you know, even when the world is telling you you're wrong.
All right, let's shift gears now and talk about politics and intelligence.
Okay, yeah, because the stakes are even higher there.
And the consequences of failure can be massive.
Wars, economic collapse, you name it.
And the report talks about how in these areas, it often comes down to misjudgment.
Like failing to understand what other actors are really up to.
Or being susceptible to
Yeah,
deception.
like falling for a bluff.
And the example they give is the U.S. intelligence failure to anticipate the 1979 Iranian Revolution.
Oh, right. The Shah was overthrown.
Hmm.
The Ayatollah Khomeini came to power.
It was a huge turning point in the region.
And the U.S. intelligence community was caught completely flat-footed.
And there were a lot of reasons for that.
Like what?
Well, they didn't have enough people who spoke Farsi.
So they couldn't really understand what was being said on the ground.
And they were relying on these outdated assumptions.
Like what?
Like, they thought religion wouldn't be a major factor in Iranian politics.
But it turned out to be the driving force behind the revolution.
And they were too focused on leftist threats.
So they missed the rising religious movement.
And they weren't really engaging with a diverse range of perspectives.
So they were getting a very limited picture of what was going on.
So it was a whole series of missteps.
And it led to a major intelligence failure.
And then, of course, there's the lead up to the 2003 invasion of Iraq,
The whole WMD thing.
where the U.S. intelligence community concluded that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction.
Which turned out to be false.
And the report argues that this wasn't just about political pressure.
It's like the Bush administration pushing for war.
Right. They say there were other factors at play, too.
Like what?
Like, this idea of overlearning from past experiences.
Meaning?
Like, they were so focused on the fact that Saddam Hussein had tried to hide his WMD program in the past.
During the first Gulf War.
Right. That they assumed he was doing the same thing again.
So they misinterpreted the evidence.
Exactly. And they also relied on some pretty unreliable sources.
Oh, right, like those defectors who were giving them bad information.
And there wasn't enough debate within the intelligence community.
Like, people weren't challenging each other's assumptions enough.
And then there's the whole issue of cognitive biases.
Which we talked about earlier.
Right, things like confirmation bias.
Where you only look for information that confirms what you already believe.
And that definitely played a role here.
So a whole bunch of factors combined to create this massive intelligence failure.
And then there's Joseph Stalin.
The Soviet dictator.
Yeah. He completely failed to anticipate the German invasion of the USSR in 1941.
Operation Barbarossa.
And that was despite the fact that there were clear intelligence warnings.
Really? So why didn't he see it coming?
Well, he was convinced that Hitler wouldn't attack.
Wow.
He had this non-aggression pact with Hitler.
The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact.
And he didn't want to provoke Germany.
So he basically ignored all the evidence that contradicted his beliefs.
And he also created this atmosphere of fear.
So his intelligence officials were afraid to tell him anything he didn't want to hear.
And the Germans were really good at deception.
Like they were deliberately feeding the Soviets misinformation.
So it was a combination of Stalin's own biases.
And the effectiveness of German deception.
And it led to a devastating surprise attack.
Which almost cost the Soviets the war.
And then there's the more recent Hamas attack on Israel.
In October 2023.
Which again seems like a major intelligence failure.
Yeah, how could they not see that coming?
Well, it seems like there's this tendency to dismiss some intelligence as just aspirational.
Like Hamas was just talking tough but wouldn't actually do anything.
And they were stuck in their existing threat models.
Not considering the possibility that Hamas might try something completely different.
And they underestimated Hamas's capabilities.
They didn't think Hamas could pull off something on that scale.
And there was this perception that Hamas was too focused on internal Palestinian politics.
That they wouldn't risk a major conflict with Israel,
And apparently there were some internal political issues within Israel as well.
which may have distracted them from the threat.
So it's another example of how, even with all our intelligence gathering and
But
technology,
you're still vulnerable to these human errors.
right, it's like the human element is always going to be a factor.
And that brings us back to those cognitive biases.
Those pesky mental shortcuts.
That can lead to some pretty bad decisions.
Even among smart people.
Even especially among smart people.
Because they might think they're immune to them.
Right. Like, oh, I'm too smart to fall for that.
But the report makes it clear that nobody is immune.
So let's recap some of the key biases,
Okay, so we've got confirmation bias.
which is that tendency to look for information that confirms what you already believe.
And to ignore evidence that contradicts your beliefs.
It's like that CEO who only reads the market research that supports their new product idea.
And they ignore all the research that suggests it's a bad idea.
Classic confirmation bias,
Then there's overconfidence bias.
where you overestimate your own abilities,
It includes the Dunning-Kruger effect.
where people who are incompetent at something are also unable to recognize their own incompetence.
It's like they're too dumb to know they're dumb.
And it can lead to some pretty disastrous decisions.
Like that brilliant scientist who tries to branch out into a new field.
Thinks that their general intelligence is enough to make them an instant expert,
But they end up making some pretty basic mistakes.
because they don't have the specific knowledge and experience in that field.
So expertise in one area doesn't automatically translate to competence in another.
That's a really important point.
And then we have anchoring bias.
Where you get fixated on the first piece of information you receive,
Even if it's irrelevant or misleading.
like in a negotiation. If the other side throws out a ridiculously low offer first
You might get anchored to that low number,
and have trouble getting them to move up to a more reasonable price.
even though you know that initial offer was absurd.
It's like your brain gets stuck on that first number,
Then there's groupthink.
where you go along with the group's decision, even if you have doubts.
Like you're afraid to speak up and rock the boat,
So you just go along with whatever everyone else is saying.
even if you think it's a bad idea.
And that can lead to some really bad outcomes.
Like, nobody wants to be the one to point out the emperor has no clothes.
Then there's availability bias,
Where you make decisions based on the information that's most readily available in your memory.
even if it's not the most accurate or relevant information.
Like, if you just read a news story about a plane crash,
You might suddenly become terrified of flying.
even though statistically, flying is still much safer than driving.
But that plane crash is fresh in your mind, so it seems like a bigger risk,
And finally, there's the bias blind spot.
where you're able to see biases in other people.
But you're blind to your own biases.
It's like that person who's always accusing everyone else of being closed-minded.
But they're the most closed-minded person you know.
It's a classic case of projection.
And the report emphasizes that awareness of these biases is key to mitigating their impact.
Yeah, you have to know what they are and how they can trip you up.
But even then, it's not a guarantee.
Because we're all human, and we all have these biases.
It's just part of how our brains work.
And then on top of these biases, there's the whole issue of adaptability.
Right, like the world is constantly changing.
And if you can't adapt, you're going to get left behind.
The report talks about how a lack of adaptability is a major reason why smart people fail.
It's like they get stuck in their ways.
They cling to past successes,
They resist new ideas,
and they fail to anticipate trends.
and that could be fatal, especially in a fast-moving world.
Like, think about Blockbuster Video.
Oh yeah, they completely missed the shift to streaming,
They were so focused on their brick-and-mortar stores,
that they didn't see Netflix coming.
and it wiped them out.
It's a classic example of how a lack of adaptability can kill even a giant company.
And the report also talks about the importance of learning from mistakes.
Right, like when you screw up, you need to figure out why,
And then adjust your strategy for the future.
so you don't make the same mistake twice.
But some people, they just can't do that.
They dismiss their failures.
They rationalize their errors.
They blame other people.
And they never learn,
And they keep making the same mistakes over and over again.
which is a recipe for disaster.
Absolute.
And then there's the whole fear of failure thing.
Yeah, that can be a real roadblock.
It can prevent you from taking risks,
From trying new things.
from innovating.
Because you're so afraid of messing up.
And that can lead to stagnation.
You become risk averse.
You play it safe all the time.
And you miss out on opportunities.
So a healthy tolerance for risk is actually a good thing.
Yeah, you have to be willing to fail sometimes.
It's just how you learn and grow.
And sometimes The biggest breakthroughs come from the biggest failures.
Of course, we also have to acknowledge that sometimes failure is just due to external factors.
Things outside of your control.
Like economic downturns.
Or technological disruption.
Or natural disasters.
Or pandemics.
Or wars.
Or just plain bad luck.
Yes, sometimes you can do everything right.
And still fail.
Because the world throws you a curveball.
And there's nothing you can do about it.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive,
what are some of the key takeaways?
I think the biggest one is that intelligence is not a guarantee of success.
Right. It's just one piece of the puzzle.
And it can actually be a liability if it's not accompanied by other things.
Like self-awareness, adaptability, humility.
The ability to learn from mistakes.
And a willingness to take risks.
And even then, sometimes you're just going to fail.
Because the world is a complex and unpredictable place.
And that's okay.
It is. It's part of the journey.
What matters is how you respond to failure.
Do you learn from it?
Do you adapt?
Do you get back up and try again?
Because that's what separates the truly successful people
from the ones who just give up.
So as you, our listener, reflect on all of this.
Think about the role that these factors play in your own life.
And in your own work.
And how you can use this knowledge to make better decisions.
And to be more successful.
In whatever you do.
Because understanding why smart people fail
can help us all succeed.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a fascinating conversation.
And until next time, keep learning, keep growing.
And don't be afraid to fail.
Because sometimes that's where the real magic happens.
Exactly.
See ya.
Bye-bye.